5 months ago, I met a new friend here at New Hope Church. I was preaching a sermon on a judge, if you were here, on the vocation of a judge, and her husband was a judge, and she came along with her husband. Her name was Jennifer Gardner, and she had cancer, late-stage cancer. After about a sentence or two of conversing, she reached out and hugged me. And I very quickly came to know arguably one of the most accepting, free-spirited, fierce, out-loud, flamboyant, and joie de vivre embodying human beings I've ever met. And then a month later, on February 22nd, Jen died of complications related to colorectal cancer. During her last month, I started following her on her cancer crusading Jen Unplugged Facebook page and learned that a lot of people were kind of journeying with her in that. And I saw this photo. And this is Jen Gardner. And for the first time as I looked at the photo this week, that wacky ring on her finger, it looks like she picked it to match the mask that they have to put on her head to keep her head from moving for the radiation therapy treatment. Yeah, sequined gown. And the moment I saw the image, and this was already resonating in me as I was talking to her that first Sunday, I thought, I should preach on the science of radiation therapy, this treatment that is being used to try and save her life. So a few days later, I get an email from a friend who's visiting his daughter in BC, coming through Banff, and wanted to know if he came to Calgary, if I'd be free to go for coffee with him. And this was my friend who 22 years ago walked up to me in a church and said, "John, I think you should go into the ministry." And I was a developer at the time, and I knew he was right. So anyway, my friend calls, says, "Let's meet." So we meet at the Good Earth Cafe, and I discover that my friend has written the book on radiation physics. He's a radiation physicist, and he's written 3,000-page textbooks that have been a big part of the training of people who are doing this kind of work in our city and across Canada and around the world. So I'm a little dense, but I'm thinking that might have been an affirmation to go ahead and preach on this topic. And so I asked him if he'd help, and Jake said he would. And then I sent this note to Jen in response to the picture. "Hey Jen, I love your spirit. Yesterday I met with an old friend who's a leading medical physicist and a big player in the field. He told me about the books he's written on the science/machines treatment you're being zapped with. And I kept thinking about you as he spoke about the science in his work. And so we made a plan to research and preach a sermon on the topic of radiation therapy with this working title, quote, "God's often hopeful, time-buying, sometimes life-saving via radiation-renewing, cancer butt-kicking," might have used another word instead of butt there, "presence at the Tom Baker Cancer Center," unquote. As my physicist friend described the various generations of radiation treatment methodologies that he's worked with and studied and helped develop, and how they were able to more and more precisely focus in on and zap tumors, all I could imagine was the beautiful scientific mind and heart of God, working through all of those physicists, physicians, and cancer care-giving image bearers he'd made. And it got me thinking, what does science, the science in behind cancer-killing radiation therapy, say about how God thinks, about who he is, and about how he hates cancer? And so those have been my questions for the last couple of weeks. What does the science in behind cancer-killing radiation therapy say about how God thinks, about who he is, and about how he hates cancer? The worldview, again, is that would lead me and us to explore this question this way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He made everything that is. Nothing that exists apart from being a thought in the mind of God before it ever came to be. So what we do in this science, somebody thought about before we came to trip upon and think about it. In Genesis 1:27, it says that human beings are made in the image of God. So all of you, in a way, reflect the character and nature and image God in who you are, in your bodies, in your rationality, in your creativity, in your scientific prowess, if you're a radiation therapist or a physicist. And in that imaging, you kind of point to something unique, because you're unique and specific about the nature, identity, and being of God. And we believe in this community that the cultural products that we create as God's image bearers, fields of science and business and geology and whatever, that those too also reflect God in a kind of secondary or tertiary way. And so the field of medicine has something to say about the healing heart of God. And the field of radiation therapy, that little radiation beam of science and medicine, says something unique within that larger scope of medicine. So, back to the question, what does radiation therapy uniquely say, or how does it uniquely image God? One thing I've discovered through the process is that there is a very broad scope and multidisciplinary nature to this particular field of science. Especially when it started, it was huge. During that phone call with Jake, he said, the interesting thing about radiation therapy historically, especially so, and still now, is that it has involved people from disciplines beyond medical doctors. It has involved medical physicists. It has involved radiation therapists. And because medical physicists are effectively scientists, it has had a much closer liaison with science and the science of medicine. If you look back at the history of radiation therapy, it was one of the earliest sub-disciplines of medicine to use computers, to do our dose calculations and see the images and so on. Clinical trials were also developed early on, more quantitatively in radiation therapy than they were in other areas of medicine, because there were more scientists involved in the process. Now, he quickly added a caveat after saying that. Of course, all of medicine now, or much of medicine, is catching up to radiation therapists and radiation physicists in this regard. But this particular field led the way, and in many ways, he thought, still leads the way, in terms of the integration of pure science into medicine, and physics, and math, and geometry, alongside human biology. By bringing the power of the knowledge of all of those diverse fields together, the invisible knife of radiation treatment can be wielded with a precision and accuracy and efficacy, more so than it ever could were it not a multidisciplinary thing. The best healing possible, and not perfect, can come through the bringing together of science and math and biology and software design. Without computers or complex algorithms or a deep understanding of particle physics, we could not do what we do today when we effectively do radiation therapy and buy people some time, save people's lives for a while. And that says to me that God is the Lord of everything, from the laws of physics to the rational empiricism of a scientist's mind to the world-shaping creativity of a software designer and of mathematicians to the pragmatic healing sensibilities and capabilities of a physician to the very human nature and biology of a patient. All of that belongs to God. And when a field of science and medicine draws on all that God has made more so than other medical fields, this reflects the breadth and the scope and the depth of God's healing heart. The scope of remedies that God has at hand to effect healing when God chooses to, a mystery, the timing. And the extent to which God can go with all of those, that breadth of remedy, says something about who God is. From an overall eternal perspective, God has brought all that He is and can and knows and has made to bear, ultimately, in the eternal scope of things, to heal you. Even if the medical field says this is all we can do for you, Mr. Whitsack. Because now is not forever. He owns physics. He was the original physicist, the mind of Christ in mediating everything. All math and software belong to God, and God is the Lord of all human biology. And when we see so much of what we're able to do through radiation therapy and as a human race to bring healing in this regard, we are seeing something in the wholeness and the breadth and the scope of that of Him. A three-in-one God, a multidisciplinary Trinity, perfectly imaged in physicists and biology experts and all of us. A God who would give everything and pour resources into healing you. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son. Could He give more? In that Son, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, particle physics. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities or radiation beams, all things have been created through Him and for Him. Because the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For He created you and your inmost being. He knit you together in your mother's womb. And you can praise Him because you're fearfully and wonderfully made, your physical body and your being. Your works, Lord, are wonderful. I know that full well. And when it all fails and falls apart, and cells do what they're not supposed to do and multiply madly, and the mysteries of cancer and death and mortality are upon us early, in our pain and our loss and our suffering, we can also know what the psalmist writes, that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are attentive to their cry. The righteous cry out, and God hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, especially so, the Bible teaches, those who are desperate and know they need God, and saves those who are crushed in spirit.